The desert had a silence that could unnerve even the bravest man. The wind whispered over the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of dust, gun oil, and old blood. In the heart of that vast and unforgiving land, an Apache warrior rode alone beneath the dying sun. His dark hair moved with the wind, his face unreadable, painted with streaks of earth and ash. He had seen too much of death to fear it now, yet there was a strange unease in his heart that day. The horizon shimmered red like the edge of a wound, and somewhere beyond it, trouble was brewing. The land had been restless for weeks. Settlers from the east had been pushing deeper into Apache territory, their wagons creaking across sacred ground, cutting through lands where the bones of ancestors lay hidden beneath the sand. The warrior had kept his distance, watching, studying. But this time, fate led him where his instincts told him not to go. The buzzards circling above drew his attention first. They hung low over a dry riverbed, their wings casting fleeting shadows across the cracked earth. When he rode closer, he saw a wagon half buried in dust, its wheels splintered, one horse lying dead beside it. The smell of decay stung his nose, but underneath it was something else, a faint cry, weak and trembling. He dismounted silently and approached with caution. Inside the shattered wagon, hidden beneath a torn canvas, were two young women. Their skin was pale, their lips cracked from thirst. One of them looked up, eyes wide with terror when she saw him. She tried to lift a broken rifle, but her hand shook too much to hold it. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached into his pouch and handed her a piece of dried meat and a small flask of water. She hesitated, then took it with trembling fingers. The younger sister, barely more than 16, tried to sit up, whispering something about their father and the wagon train that had gone missing. Her voice broke as she spoke. The Apache listened quietly, his eyes scanning the distance, searching for signs of life or death. The land around them was silent, except for the wind. He knew others could be watching. This was dangerous ground for all of them. Still, he couldn't leave them there. The white man's world and his were enemies, yet something human bound them at that moment: need, fear, and the fragile threat of survival. He lifted the younger girl gently and placed her on his horse, then helped the older one follow. They didn't protest. Exhaustion had taken the strength from their bones. He led them through the dusk, moving toward the shelter of a canyon a few miles away. The sisters whispered quietly behind him, sometimes too weak to stay awake. When they reached a shallow cave, he gathered brushwood and started a small fire. Its glow painted their faces with a soft, trembling light. For the first time, he saw them clearly, one with soft brown hair matted from dust, the other with golden strands tangled around her shoulders. They looked like they had once belonged to a world of lace and warm hearths, not this cruel wilderness. When the fire crackled to life, the older sister spoke again. Her voice was cautious but sincere. She said they had been traveling west with their parents and a group of settlers when Apaches had attacked near the San Pedro Valley. Believed her family had been killed. The warrior said nothing. His eyes reflected the flames, unreadable as ever. Deep inside, though, he knew that not every battle was what it seemed. Many raids blamed on the Apache were done by drifters, bounty hunters, or even rival tribes pretending to be his people. Still, he didn't argue, only said they should rest until sunrise. As night settled, the desert came alive with sounds: the call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through dry brush. The sisters huddled together, their eyes darting toward every shadow. They didn't trust him, not yet. But they were too tired to fear him completely. The warrior sat near the fire, sharpening his knife with slow, rhythmic strokes. The steel caught the light and gleamed with a cold beauty. He wasn't thinking of violence. He was thinking of what came next. Somewhere beyond the dark hills, riders were gathering. The warrior had seen smoke signals earlier that had signs of tension, warnings between bands. Rumors had spread that the soldiers from Fort Wilkins had shot an Apache boy near the river, mistaking him for a thief. Retaliation would come soon. War was a spark waiting for wind. At dawn, the sisters stirred. The older one asked what his name was. He hesitated before answering. To speak one's name to strangers was a rare thing among his people. But something in her eyes, something fragile and searching, made him relent. He spoke his name quietly, and she nodded, trying to repeat it, though her tongue struggled with the foreign syllables. He smiled faintly, not mocking her, but almost amused. Then, without a word, he packed his horse and offered them food again. They followed him through narrow trails and rocky valleys, their dresses torn and their shoes nearly gone. The sun was fierce, burning their skin as they walked. Every now and then he stopped to let them rest, offering water sparingly. The land was his ally. He knew where to find hidden springs, which plants could be eaten, and where danger lurked. The sisters began to see him differently, not as the savage they had been warned about, but as a man who understood the rhythm of the earth in ways they never could. By the time they reached a grove of mesquite trees, the younger sister's strength began to fail again. The warrior carried her on his back without a word, his breath steady, his movements sure. The older one followed closely, her heart heavy with confusion. She had been taught that men like him were the enemy, but nothing in his actions spoke of hatred. Instead, he had given them what no one else had: mercy. They reached a stream by midday. Sisters knelt to drink, their faces reflected in the clear water. The warrior watched them silently, scanning the ridges for movement. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp and lonely. When he finally relaxed, he spoke for the first time in hours. He said there would be safety ahead near the foothills, where they could find other travelers or a military post. The older sister looked up at him, unsure if she wanted to part ways so soon. Something about his presence, silent yet protective, had begun to feel like the only steady thing left in her broken world. But fate was already shifting beneath their feet. That evening, when they reached the open plains beyond the river, they saw smoke rising in the distance, thick, black and angry. The warrior's face hardened. He knew what it meant before a sound even reached them. Then faintly the wind carried it the echo of gunfire, the distant rumble of horses, the wailing cries of war. The sisters turned toward him, fear widening their eyes. The older one asked what was happening, her voice trembling. Didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the smoke, his hand tightening around the handle of his knife. The air around them seemed to thicken with dread. Finally he spoke in a low, grave tone. He said the soldiers had come. The truce was broken. His people would rise to fight. The world they knew, his and theirs, was about to burn. The sisters looked toward the smoke again, and for a moment, the silence between them said everything words could not. The man who had saved their lives was now caught between two worlds at war. The next choice he made would decide whether they all lived or died before the sun set again. The warrior stood motionless for a long moment, watching the smoke rise like a dark wound against the sky. The sisters waited behind him, unsure what to do or say. The younger one clutched her sister's arm, whispering that maybe it was just a campfire. But deep down, even she knew it wasn't. The Apache turned to them finally, his expression hard, yet not cruel. He said they needed to move. His tone left no room for argument. Whatever had started out there would soon spread, and anyone caught between the soldiers and the tribes would not be spared. They followed him through the tall grass, the air growing hotter and heavier with each mile. The older sister kept glancing back at the columns of smoke, wondering if her father might still be alive somewhere in that direction. Part of her wanted to run toward it to find answers, but she didn't dare. The warrior seemed to sense her struggle. Without looking at her, he said softly that no good could be found where fire was rising. His words carried a quiet finality that stilled her heart. As the day went on, the heat became unbearable. The land seemed to shimmer, bending the horizon until it looked like the earth itself was breathing. They stopped beneath a rocky ledge, where a few scrubby bushes offered shade. The warrior took out a pouch of crushed leaves and mixed them with water, handing the cup to the younger sister. She hesitated, but took it, and after drinking, her strength slowly began to return. The older sister thanked him, but he only nodded. Among his people, gratitude was not spoken much. Actions were what mattered. When the sun sank lower, painting the desert in gold and red, he began to speak quietly, as if thinking aloud. He told them about his people, the way they lived before the soldiers came. The land was their mother, he said. Every mountain, every stream, had a spirit. The Apaches hunted only what they needed and honored the animals they took. He spoke of the seasons, of how the desert bloomed after rare rains, and how the elders said the stars were the eyes of those who had gone before. His words were steady, filled with pride, but beneath that pride was pain. The sisters listened in silence. They had heard stories before, tales told around campfires or whispered by soldiers in forts, stories that painted the Apache as wild and heartless. But the man before them didn't match those stories. There was something deeply human about him, something unshakably calm even in the face of danger. The older sister began to wonder how much of what she had been taught was really true. That night they camped near a dried riverbed. The wind carried distant sounds, faint gunfire, the cry of horses, and once, what might have been a scream. The sisters couldn't sleep. The younger one wept softly, clutching her shawl as if it could protect her. The warrior kept watch, crouched near the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness. Once, when the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed through the stillness, he reached for his bow, ready to defend. But the noise faded, leaving only the whisper of wind through the mesquite. When dawn came, the air smelled of smoke again. It started moving early, heading toward the foothills. The warrior said there was a spring ahead, where they could rest safely for a time. The trail wound through sharp rocks and thorny bushes. The sisters stumbled often, their skirts catching on the thorns, yet the warrior never grew impatient. When the younger girl fell, he helped her up without a word, his movements quiet and sure. By midday, they reached the spring. Water trickled from a crack in the rock, clear and cool. The sisters drank deeply, washing the dust from their faces. The older one smiled faintly, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. But the warrior's gaze remained distant. He could feel change in the air, heavy and near. He knew the soldiers would soon sweep across these lands, searching for any Apache they could find, guilty or not. As they rested, the older sister asked him how long the war would last. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a handful of sand, letting it slip through his fingers. Then he said wars between his people and the white men were like the wind, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce, but always returning. No matter who lost or won, the land paid the price. The words stayed with her. She had grown up believing the frontier was a promise of freedom, a place where hard work could build a new life. But now she saw another truth. The land was already home to others long before the wagons arrived. Her father had said the Apache would never yield because they didn't understand progress. But maybe it wasn't progress they feared. Maybe it was being forgotten. Later that day, the warrior found signs that others had passed nearby hoofprints, ashes still warm from a fire.
Oh.
He crouched low, studying the marks. The sisters watched nervously. When he arose, his face was tense. He said soldiers were near, moving west. The sisters looked at each other in alarm. The older one asked if they would attack. The warrior replied that soldiers shot first and asked questions later. They had to keep moving, away from the main trails. They walked until the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The younger sister grew quiet, her strength fading again. The warrior carried her once more, his pace unbroken. As darkness fell, they reached a ridge overlooking a wide plain. From there, they saw flickers of fire in the distant military camps, perhaps, or burning homesteads. The warrior's jaw tightened. He said softly that when war began, no one remembered who struck first. Everyone bled the same. They set camp among the rocks. The older sister watched him as he built the fire. His hands were rough but gentle, his movements almost graceful. She wanted to ask him why he helped them when their kind had caused so much harm to his. But something in his expression stopped her. It wasn't anger. Exactly, it was something older, like weariness carved deep into his bones. When night deepened, he finally spoke again, telling them about the first time he saw soldiers. He had been a boy not yet old enough to join the warriors. The soldiers came, claiming peace, offering food and shiny trinkets. Then, without warning, they burned the camp. He escaped, but many didn't. Since that day, he said, he had learned to trust actions more than promises. The older sister lowered her eyes, unable to find words. The world she came from suddenly felt smaller, its rules less certain. The younger sister stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about home. The warrior glanced toward her and then at the stars. The night was clear, and the sky looked endless. He told the older sister that his people believed the stars guided lost souls. Maybe, he said, her family could see them now, and were watching over her. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to think the world still held kindness, even here among death and war. By the next morning, the smoke in the sky had thickened. Distant thunder rolled across the plains, but it wasn't thunder. The warrior knew that sound too well. Cannon fire. The war had begun in full. He motioned for the sisters to move quickly. The land that had seemed empty only days before now felt alive with danger. Every sound, every shadow could hide enemies. They crossed a dry ravine and climbed toward higher ground. From the ridge they saw a long line of horsemen moving below soldiers, their rifles glinting in the sunlight. The sisters froze, panic rising in their throats. The warrior pulled them down behind a rock, signaling for silence. They stayed there for what felt like hours as the soldiers passed. Dust filled the air, choking and bitter. When the last of the riders disappeared, the warrior stood slowly. He knew they were heading toward his village. His people would not flee. They would fight. The thought made his chest tighten. He turned to the sisters, his face unreadable, but his voice held something heavy when he said they must go the other way. Couldn't protect them if they stayed near the fighting. The older sister shook her head. She said they couldn't survive alone, not in this land. The warrior looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes, and for a moment something softened in his expression. He said he would take them farther north, to the trading post beyond the valley. But after that, they must go on without him. They began moving again, the sound of distant gunfire following them like a ghost. The sky turned gray, heavy with dust and smoke. The sisters walked close together, their hearts pounding, the world they once knew slipping farther away with each step. The warrior led the way, his figure steady against the chaos. Yet even he knew that before the next dawn, blood would stain the sand again. And somewhere out there, beyond the hills, both soldiers and Apache warriors were preparing for the battle that would decide not only their survival, but the fate of everyone caught between two worlds that no longer knew how to live in peace. The wind carried. The smell of burning wood and iron, twisting across the valley like a warning. The Apache warrior paused at the edge of the trail, his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. He could see faint flashes of light in the distance gunfire, small but steady. The war had already reached the edge of the land he had hoped to protect. Behind him, the two sisters followed in silence. Their faces were pale, dust-streaked, and tired, but neither spoke of turning back. The world behind them was gone, and what lay ahead was uncertain. They reached a narrow pass where the rocks rose high on both sides, jagged and sharp like teeth. The warrior stopped to listen. The ground beneath his boots seemed to hum faintly. The vibration of distant horses. He motioned for the sisters to stay low. The older one obeyed quickly, pulling her younger sister beside her, behind a cluster of stones. From there, they watched as a patrol of soldiers appeared down the trail, their blue coats darkened with sweat, their rifles ready. The warrior's hand went to his knife, but he didn't move. Fighting them would bring death to all three. Instead, he led the sisters quietly up the slope, moving between the shadows until they disappeared from view. When they were safe again, the younger sister asked in a trembling voice why the soldiers would shoot them if they saw them. The warrior answered without turning. He said the soldiers didn't see people when they looked at him. They saw a target. The sisters looked at each other, the truth of his words sinking deep. The older one began to realize how cruelly the world divided people who shared the same sky. They kept moving until the land flattened into a wide stretch of grass. The warrior knew this place once. His tribe had camped here during spring hunts. He could almost hear the laughter of children, the songs that rose with the night wind. Oh, it was empty, except for the bones of an old campfire buried in dust. He knelt and touched the ashes gently, as if greeting ghosts. The sisters waited quietly, sensing this was sacred ground. He told them that his people had moved north weeks ago to escape the soldiers, but some bands had stayed behind. Those who stayed would not surrender. They would fight until the last man fell. His voice carried no pride, only a deep sorrow that came from knowing the cycle would never end. The older sister wanted to comfort him but didn't know how. She only said softly that not all white people wanted war. The warrior looked at her, his dark eyes steady, said he believed her, but the land believed only what it saw, and it had seen too much blood. That night, they found shelter under a large rock ledge near a dry-streamed bay. The sky above them was filled with stars, cold and bright. The warrior built a small fire, using dried grass and bits of cedar he carried in his pouch. The flames flickered softly, painting shadows across the stone. The sisters sat close, wrapping their shawls tighter around their shoulders. The older sister asked if he had family nearby. He didn't answer at first. Then he said he once had a brother, a brave man who fought alongside him. The soldiers captured him during a raid near the border. No one ever saw him again. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The younger sister stared into the flames, her eyes glistening. She whispered that she missed her father. The warrior said quietly that fathers never leave. They walk in the wind and whisper through the trees. It was his way of saying what he couldn't in plain words, that memory keeps love alive, even when the world turns cruel. As dawn approached, the wind changed again. It carried faint sounds, voices, horses, the clinking of metal. The warrior's body tensed. He rose, scanning the horizon. The soldiers were closer than he thought. He woke the sisters quickly and doused the fire. They packed what little they had and started moving north again. The younger sister stumbled, still weak, but the older one held her up. The warrior led them along a narrow ravine, moving fast and silent. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley dotted with mesquite trees. Smoke rose from the far end, thicker this time. The warrior's face darkened. He recognized the pattern of that smoke. It came from his people's fires. The soldiers had found them. The sisters saw it too. The older one turned to him, her voice trembling. She asked if he would go to them. Didn't answer right away. His heart was torn between duty and mercy. His people were likely outnumbered, and every warrior would be needed. But if he left the sisters alone, they would not survive a single night in that harsh land. The choice felt like a stone pressing against his chest. Finally, he told them he had to see what was happening. He would take them to a safe place. First a small cave near the foothills where they could hide. The older sister protested, saying they couldn't let him face danger alone. But he only gave her a steady look. He said that some battles couldn't be shared. They reached the cave by late afternoon. It was small but deep, hidden by brush and rock. He gave them food and water, promising he would return by nightfall. The younger sister clung to his arm, fear clouding her face. He rested a hand gently on her shoulder and said she must be brave. Then he turned and left, his figure soon blending with the desert. Time passed slowly. The sisters sat close together, listening to the faint rumble of the earth. Gunfire echoed in the distance, each shot tightening the knot of fear inside them. The older sister prayed quietly, though she wasn't sure who was listening anymore. As the sun began to set, shadows crept across the cave's entrance. She kept glancing toward the path, hoping to see him return. But instead of the Apache, they saw something else. 2 men on horseback, wearing dusty uniforms. Soldiers. The sisters froze. The men dismounted and began searching the rocks nearby, talking in low voices. One of them mentioned finding tracks leading in this direction. The older sister held her breath, pulling her younger sibling close. The soldiers moved closer, their boots crunching against the gravel. Suddenly, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The soldiers stopped, startled. Before they could react, an arrow flew from the ridge, striking the ground beside them. Then another came, closer. The men cursed, grabbing their rifles, but they couldn't see where the attack was coming from. They fired blindly toward the rocks, the gunshots echoing off the cliffs. The sisters crouched lower, their hearts pounding. They could hear the horses panicking, the shouts of the soldiers as they tried to mount and flee. Within moments, the sound of retreating hooves faded into the distance. Silence returned, broken only by the soft rustle of wind. Then, out of the fading light, the warrior appeared. His face was streaked with dust and blood not his own. He walked carefully, his bow still in hand. When he reached the cave, the sisters rushed to him. The younger one began to cry, and for the first time he placed a hand gently on her head, as if comforting a frightened child. He told them the fighting near the valley was worse than he feared. The soldiers had attacked at dawn, burning homes and taking prisoners. Some of his people had escaped, others hadn't. His voice was low, but behind it burned quiet anger. The older sister asked if his tribe would fight back. He said they already were, but the soldiers had more guns, more men, and they would not stop until every Apache camp was destroyed. That night, they sat together in silence. The warrior stared into the fire, his expression distant. The older sister studied him, wondering how much loss one person could bear before breaking. She thought about her own father, how he believed the frontier could tame the wild. Now she saw the wild was not something to be tamed. It was something that lived in all people, waiting for the right moment to rise. Before dawn, the warrior said he had to go back. His people would need help, and he couldn't stay hidden. The sisters begged him not to go. He looked at them, torn but resolute. He told them they would find safety if they followed the trail north to the trading post. There were men there who might help. He promised he would find them again if he survived. As he stepped into the cold morning, the older sister called after him, asking why he cared so much for them when he had every reason to hate their kind. He paused, his back still turned. Then he said something that stayed with her long after he disappeared into the desert. He said that hate was easy, but mercy took strength, and in times of war, strength was the only thing worth saving. She watched him vanish into the pale light, his figure swallowed by the land that had shaped him. Behind her, the younger sister whispered his name like a prayer, and as the sun rose over the burning plains, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The sound of distant thunder guns or storms rolled across the horizon, and the sisters knew their journey through this wounded land was far from over. The sisters started their journey north, just as the morning light began to spill across the desert. The air was cool, sharp with the smell of sage and smoke. Behind them, faint plumes still rose where the Apache village had burned. The older sister looked back once, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe the warrior would return, that his promise was more than just words carried on the wind. But every mile they walked made that hope feel smaller. The land was rough, carved by old rivers and scattered with stones that glimmered under the sun. Their shoes were worn thin, their dresses torn. The younger sister limped, exhaustion weighing her down, but she didn't complain. She only asked once if the warrior would be safe. The older sister told her yes, though she didn't know if she believed it. The silence between them grew, broken only by the soft scrape of boots against dry earth. By midday, the heat was harsh. The horizon shimmered, bending the air into false rivers that vanished when they drew closer. They found a patch of shade beneath a lone cottonwood tree and stopped to rest. The older sister took out the last bit of dried meat the warrior had given them. She broke it in half, giving the larger piece to her sister. Neither spoke as they ate. After a while, the older sister heard something faint and dull, rhythmic thud carried by the wind. She stood and shaded her eyes, staring toward the south. At first it seemed like nothing more than the pulse of wind through the canyons. But then she saw it, dust rising in the distance, steady and low. Riders, too many to count. Fear gripped her chest. She woke her sister quickly, pulling her to her feet. They couldn't tell if it was soldiers or warriors, but either way, staying in the open meant death. They began to run toward the rocky hills to the west, their breath ragged, feet slipping on the uneven ground. The younger sister stumbled once, scraping her knee, but the older one didn't stop. She could hear the sound growing louder, now horses galloping fast, voices shouting commands. When they reached the ridge, they ducked behind a cluster of rocks, gasping for air. From there, they saw the riders below soldiers. Dozens of them, riding hard, their uniforms dusty and their rifles glinting. The sisters crouched low, praying not to be seen. The soldiers stopped near the old cottonwood, scanning the area. One of them pointed toward the tracks in the sand, their tracks. The sisters' hearts pounded as the soldiers turned their horses and began following the trail. The older sister whispered that they had to keep moving. They crawled along the rocks until they reached a narrow gully leading deeper into the hills. The terrain was rough, but it offered cover. They moved as fast as they could, their lungs burning, the sound of hoofbeats echoing behind them. By late afternoon, the air grew cooler, but their fear hadn't faded. The hills thickened into canyons, the walls closing in like prison bars. The older sister stopped, listening. The horses were closer now, voices echoing through the narrow spaces. She pulled her sister behind a large boulder and pressed a finger to her lips. The soldiers were searching the ravine, calling out to each other. One voice carried clearly through the still air an officer, shouting that there were hostiles nearby, likely hiding with captives. The older sister understood. The soldiers thought they had been taken by Apaches. If they were found now, they'd be seen as part of the enemy. The thought made her blood run cold. She held her sister tighter, willing her to stay silent. Minutes passed like hours. Then came the sound of boots crunching gravel, slow and steady. A soldier was coming closer, his shadow stretching long across the rock. The sisters froze. The younger one covered her mouth, trembling. The soldiers stopped just a few feet away, scanning the ground. Then a sharp whistle echoed through the canyon. Another soldier called his name, saying they'd found tracks further ahead. The man turned, muttered something, and moved away. The sisters didn't breathe until the sound of footsteps faded completely. When night fell, the desert cooled sharply. The stars above were bright and cold, watching in silence. The sisters huddled together for warmth. The older one couldn't stop thinking about the warrior, where he was, whether he had survived the fighting. She wanted to believe he was still alive, moving under the same sky, maybe searching for them. Meanwhile, far away near the burning village, the Apache warrior stood among ruins and smoke. The smell of ash and iron filled his lungs. The soldiers had taken many prisoners, including women and children. His people's homes were gone, their sacred ground trampled. He watched from the shadows, anger and grief warring inside him. Beside him crouched another warrior, younger, with a deep cut along his arm. They spoke in low voices, deciding what to do next. The younger one said they should strike back before the soldiers moved camp. The warrior shook his head. Not yet. He had seen the faces of those soldiers. They were tired, desperate, and dangerous. Attacking now would only bring more death. Still, his mind was not only on vengeance. He kept thinking of the two sisters, alone somewhere in the desert. He had promised to return, and that promise weighed heavier than any weapon. He looked toward the north, where the moonlight traced the path they would have taken. He couldn't leave his people, but he couldn't abandon them either. At dawn, he made his choice. He told the others he would find the sisters, bring them to safety, and then return to fight. Some of his kin warned that it was foolish that saving outsiders, while their own suffered, was dishonor. But he didn't see it that way. He said saving them was not for the whites, it was for the spirit of what was still good in men. He set out before sunrise, riding a stolen horse and carrying only his bow and a small pouch of food. The land was quiet except for the wind. The tracks of soldiers were easy to follow, but he avoided them, keeping to the ridges. When he reached the hills by midday, he saw signs of the sisters' footprints. Light but distinct. They had gone north, just as he told them. Relief flickered in his chest, followed quickly by worry. Soldier tracks crossed theirs. Back in the canyon, the sisters had found an old campsite near a trickle of water. They were hungry and cold, but still alive. The older sister tried to keep her courage, though fear pressed against her heart like a stone. She thought about what the warrior had said, that mercy took strength. She clung to that thought every time the silence grew too heavy. That night, thunder rolled in the distance, a dry storm flashing across the horizon. Lightning lit the desert in brief, blinding bursts. The sisters took shelter beneath an overhang, watching the sky split open. The younger one cried softly, asking if they would ever see home again. The older sister held her close, whispering that home was wherever they could still breathe. Not far from them, the warrior rode through the storm. The wind lashed against his face, the horse stumbling over stones. He followed the faint trail until the rain began to erase it. He dismounted and crouched low, scanning the ground by flashes of lightning. Then he saw something that stopped him, a small piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush. It was part of a woman's dress. He picked it up and held it to his chest, knowing he was close. The next morning, the sisters woke to the sound of footsteps above them. The older one froze, thinking it was the soldiers again. She peered out carefully, heart hammering. Shadow moved across the rock stall, lean and silent. Then she saw him. The warrior stood there, soaked with rain, his hair tangled, his face drawn but alive. Relief washed over her so strong that she nearly fell to her knees. The younger sister ran to him, tears streaming down her face. The warrior said nothing at first. He only looked at them both, making sure they were unharmed. Then he told them the soldiers were close behind. The fighting had spread north. They needed to move quickly if they wanted to live. They traveled together again, this time through a land that no longer felt alive. The desert that once whispered now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Every ridge, every shadow felt dangerous. The warrior moved ahead, listening to the ground, watching for signs of pursuit. The sisters followed close, their trust in him unshaken. By sunset, They reached a deep ravine lined with jagged cliffs. The warrior said they could rest there for a few hours before crossing the open plains at night. As they gathered near a small fire, the older sister looked at him and asked what would happen when the soldiers reached his people. He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. He said there would be no surrender. The army had come not for peace, but for control. They would fight until they had nothing left. The wind shifted suddenly. The warrior stood, his eyes narrowing. In the distance, he saw movement shadows flickering along the ridge. Soldiers, too many to count. The firelight caught on their rifles as they crept closer. He turned to the sisters, his voice low but firm. He told them to stay behind the rocks and not to move until he said so. The older one grabbed his arm, fear breaking her voice, as she begged him not to go. He met her eyes, and for the first time, there was something raw. There's something more than duty. He said if he didn't stop them, no one would. Then he took his bow, stepped into the open, and vanished into the rising wind. The sisters could hear only the soft thud of arrows, the sharp crack of rifles, and the cry of men in the dark. The battle had come to them, and the desert once again became a place where mercy and death walked side by side. The morning after the battle was quiet in a way. It made the world feel hollow. Smoke rose from the valley like the breath of ghosts, curling into the pale light of dawn. The Apache warrior stood at the ridge, his face streaked with soot, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Below him, the land that had once been so alive now lay still. The war had ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind only the broken remains of pride and pain. The two sisters sat near a dying campfire, their hands clasped together, their faces pale but calm. The warrior glanced at them, and then back at the horizon where the sun struggled to rise through the haze. For the first time in many moons, he did not feel like a warrior. He felt like a man who had carried too many memories, too many battles, and now stood between two worlds that would never truly meet. The older sister, her voice soft but steady, thanked him once again for saving their lives. She didn't have to say much. He could see it in her eyes. Gratitude mixed with confusion, fear mixed with understanding. The younger one looked at him differently. She was no longer just the frightened girl he had found in the desert. There was strength now in her gaze, something she had learned in the hard way that survival teaches. She had seen men kill and die, seen mercy in a stranger where she expected hatred. She understood now that the world was not as simple as her father once told her it was. Around them, the survivors of both sides were tending to the wounded, gathering what was left. The air smelled of ash and blood, but there was also the faint scent of sage carried by the wind. The warrior turned his face toward it, taking in the smell of his homeland, the one that had given him everything and taken everything away. He knew this peace would not last. History had shown him that peace never stayed long when men thought they had something to defend. But in this brief moment, he allowed himself to believe it might. The sisters wanted to return east, back to what was left of their home. But the war had burned most of the trails, and the rivers had changed with the floods. The warrior offered to guide them through the mountains. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down, he knew this would be the last act of kindness he could give before vanishing into the stories that white men told about him. The sisters agreed, and together they set out as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the smoke and echoes of the valley. The journey was not easy. The trails were rough, and the land was wounded just like the people who lived on it. Yet as they moved, something quiet began to grow between them. It wasn't friendship in the way people usually mean it. It was something deeper, made from shared silence and survival. At night, they sat by small fires, eating what little they had. The older sister sometimes asked him about his people, about the songs they sang, or the stars they followed. He answered with simple words, but his tone carried the rhythm of something older than both their worlds combined. The younger sister listened closely. Sometimes she smiled at his words, not because she understood all of them, but because they sounded like hope. One night, when the wind was strong and the moon hid behind clouds, the warrior spoke of what war really meant. He said it wasn't just men fighting with weapons. It was fear, pride, and hunger for something that never truly belonged to anyone. He said people would keep fighting until they learned to see the same sky instead of different lands. The sisters listened, and when he stopped talking, there was nothing but the sound of the fire crackling. In that silence, they understood him better than any translation could allow. When they finally reached the edge of the mountain pass, The world beyond opened like a painting. The plains stretched wide and green, dotted with trees and distant rivers. It was the first time the sisters had seen beauty that didn't hurt. The warrior stood still, looking out at it. He knew his path ended there. His people were scattered, his home burned, but his spirit was not broken. He told the sisters they could follow the river south, where they would find a town that still stood. There, they could begin again. The older sister asked him to come with them, to find peace among their kind. He looked at her gently, shook his head, and said some paths are meant to be walked alone. They didn't argue. Deep down, they knew he was right. The warrior turned away and began walking toward the rising sun. The younger sister ran after him for a moment and placed a small silver cross in his hand. She said it was not about religion, but remembrance. He nodded, closed his fingers around it, and tucked it into the leather around his neck. Then he walked on without looking back. The sisters stood there for a long time, watching his figure grow smaller until it was only a shadow against the golden horizon. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the plains. Somewhere far behind them, the echoes of war still lingered, but ahead, the world felt new. The older sister whispered that maybe one day, people would tell stories about men like him not as enemies, but as part of the same land they all shared. Weeks later, when they reached the town, no one believed their story. People said it couldn't be true that an Apache warrior saved 2 white women in the middle of a war, but the sisters didn't argue. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, and that was enough. They settled in the town, built small lives, and carried on. Yet every night when the wind howled through the windows, the younger sister would wake and listen or see. In the rustling of the trees, she sometimes thought she could hear a distant chant, like a prayer carried on the wind. Years passed and the world changed again. Railroads came, towns grew, and the wild places shrank. The old stories faded, replaced by new ones told by people who never knew the land as it once was. But among those stories, one lingered. It spoke of an Apache warrior who saved 2 starving sisters when the desert was dying. It said that when the war came, he stood between both sides and made them see what they had become. Some said he vanished into the mountains. Others said he died protecting a child from a raid. But the truth, like the wind, never stayed still long enough to be caught. The sisters grew old but never forgot. On her final days, the younger one would sit by her window and look at the sunset, the same direction he had walked that morning. She would hold the silver cross in her hand and whisper a small prayer. Not to any god, but to the spirit of the man who showed them that mercy could exist even in the heart of war. And sometimes, when the air was still and the sky burned red, people in the valley said they saw a figure standing on the ridge, tall and silent, watching over the land. Some said it was just a shadow. Others swore it was the Apache warrior, guarding the peace he had once fought for. Whether it was truth or legend, no one ever knew. But for those who remembered, it didn't matter. What mattered was that once in a time of hate and hunger, a man chose compassion over revenge, and 2 lost souls found hope in the middle of a dying land. That was his legacy. Not the battles he fought, but the lives he saved. And though the world moved on, his story lingered like the desert wind quiet, strong and endless.